Isn't there any way we can't, Halloween this place up a bit? I mean, 'tis the season and all that. Ah, beautiful. The 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead comes in for quite a lot of flack in some parts of the horror fandom, with quite a few people simply dismissing it as a shot-for-shot pointless remake, and others complaining that it simply can't compete with the masterpiece that was George Romero's 1968 classic. The script that the remake uses is based off the original and for the most part stays relatively faithful to the plot, with only a couple of major changes. As the opening part of a trilogy, later a franchise series, Night opens with our female lead protagonist Barbara as she travels to visit her relative's grave to pay her respects. While there, both her and her brother come under attack from several of the undead. Barbara flees to a nearby farmhouse where she meets Ben, another survivor fleeing the zombie hordes. Together, the two of them decide to barricade the farmhouse and survive as long as they can until help arrives, whilst also attempting to create an escape plan as a backup. It's then revealed that they aren't the only occupants in the house, and as tensions rise and double crossings become more common, it starts to seem increasingly difficult to survive the night. The remake came about due to copyright issues involved with the original production. Due to a lapse in copyright, the film fell into the public domain, and after years of trying to rescue the rights, Romero decided an easier option would be to simply remake the film under his then current film company, and copyright the remake for himself. Additionally, as a result of Romero being very busy at this time, directional duty on this production was passed down to Tom Savini, who has an absolutely illustrious career in special effects. With Romero's blessing, Savini doesn't do a half-bad job at all in this, making the film look and feel as tense and atmospheric as he can. This was a troubled production in many ways, with Savini saying at one point that due to studio executives repeatedly trying to take the film in a different direction, that only about 40% of his ideas actually made it into the final production. Though having seen this film, I can honestly say that I didn't notice anything terribly bad from a directional standpoint. There may be one or two iffy deliveries here and there, but for the most part the actors are directed appropriately, the setups look nice, and the atmosphere is definitely there. For the most part. There are one or two moments that feel a little bit flat at times, but it's hardly the end of the world. The cinematography is nice too, and is a really good attempt at trying to mirror Romero's works. Again, it's not perfect, with maybe a little bit too frantic a pace in terms of cutting from shot to shot, but that's only a minor issue. And it's actually quite the opposite problem that I had with the original film, which I felt used too few cuts or shot types. I suppose at this point I should really put my cards on the table. I'm not really that big of a fan of the original Night of the Living Dead. I don't hate it, I just find it very much of its time. At the time the film came out, I'm sure it was absolutely revolutionary due to how graphic and culturally shocking it would have been. But it's far from a perfect film. While it does have gorgeous lighting and atmosphere, the original Barbara doesn't really have a whole lot to do in terms of plot, other than stand around and act as manic as possible for the most part. She doesn't really offer a tremendous amount of help. There's also an absolutely ridiculous amount of padding in the original, and while that padding does help create more of a tense atmosphere, and it also helps to build up the tensions between Ben and Harry, it still often leaves me clock watching for the most part. The zombies in the original are also not particularly great or memorable. Having lived in a world where zombies are in abundance and fairly commonplace, it's weird to think that in 1968 the idea of the slow shuffling, brain-eating type of zombie was an almost entirely new concept. And here they come across as more of a proof of concept than the likes of which we'd see in future zombie movies. The remake of Night offers some solutions to my issues, but creates issues in other ways. For starters, they address the problem I had with Barbra being a bit too limp by giving her a much more prominent role, and as the film progresses we see her develop from an emotionally distraught woman into a really effective leader. The issue I have with this, however, is that I think they may have gone a bit too far, and rather than just making her a prominent and active heroic female, they've ended up making her Ellen Ripley, which by modern standards could be seen as a bit too predictable, but I actually think I prefer this interpretation, even if it is a bit OTT when compared to the original. One of the other problems that I had in making Barbra a more prominent force in the group is that it really does take away from Ben being the driving force in terms of being the protagonist. And as I'd seen the original and liked Ben as a character, it did sometimes feel like he'd been toned down just a bit too much, boiled down to just the key elements, rather than letting his character breathe a bit. Though again, if watering down Ben in order to make Barbra a more well-developed character fixes a problem, then I'm okay with that. The padding elements of this film have also been greatly reduced to make the film feel more lightweight and fluid. There are a few more confrontation scenes with the zombies than in the original, and this really helps the remake zip along at a pretty reasonable pace. This, however, does create the issue that the remake simply isn't as tense and atmospheric as the original was. That pressure cooker tension between our survivors really disintegrates in this, and instead we're left with a lot of elements and messages in this film which, if you hadn't watched the original, might be lost to the audience. That's not to say that this film is unwatchable unless you've seen the original, just that the more subtle elements of the production may be lost in translation. Lighting was something I was very worried about going into this film, as the original, being shot in black and white, had absolutely gorgeous lighting that really emphasised the darkness and created an unnerving atmosphere that really gave the zombies a big push up in terms of how they appeared. The remake is okay. Shots in the house are shadowy and mysterious, they add an element of surprise in some cases, and the night shots from outside have a decent level of minimal lighting, keeping it all above board for the most part. But with the remake being shot in colour, I personally don't think that it could have ever quite created the same tone that the original film did. The visual effects are also an area where this film absolutely shines, with the zombies looking much more in line with the type seen in Dawn and Day of the Dead than the originals, and the practical effects, particularly in the death scenes, being absolutely top-notch. It really is a testimony to Savini's work to see such gorgeously gory effects in action. One of the bigger inconsistencies of this film that did bother me quite a bit was actually trying to figure out what time period this film took place in. There are elements of the late 60s present in terms of how people are dressed and how they behave, but there are also 70s and 80s cars present, and while a good chunk of the dress is based in 60s fashion, the style of the dress could be early 90s. I guess in one sense it helps to make the film feel timeless, because if you can't pin a time down to it, it could have happened any time. But at the same time, the references to other decades they do present themselves as so reflective of their eras that it becomes almost impossible to ignore that this film couldn't have realistically happened in any of them. Even the dialogue seems a bit all over the place, with some lines lifted directly from the original having a stuffy 60s vibe that then starkly contrasts with much more realistically written dialogue in the added scenes that were penned nearly 30 years later. And this left me feeling a little bit uneven overall. The soundtrack, coupled with a very muted colour grade, which in places is almost black and white in itself, really do lend heavily to the film looking and sounding as good as it does. And while again it isn't perfect, it does what it does reasonably well. One of the few very major sticking points I do have with this remake, however, is the ending, which really stops me from just out and out recommending this over the original. The original handled its ending very well, with Ben, our protagonist, getting shot after being mistaken for a zombie. which was a brilliant metaphor for the race relation issues that were absolutely rampant throughout the US at the time. The remake does away with that, instead having Ben die off screen. Barbra returns with help in the hope of maybe finding him, only to find that Ben is now a zombie. Barbra then just flat out kills Ben and murders a recently survived Harry. This film deals with a lot of issues: race, gender roles, classism, to name a few, and in changing that ending, they fundamentally removed one of the most downbeat and memorable moments of the original films. And that absolutely lowers this film's standing for me. The Night of the Living Dead remake has a lot of things going for it, both in terms of my own OCD and in the production in and of itself. I personally found it to fit in tonally, stylistically, directorially and story-wise more with Dawn and Day of the Dead than the original release did. It still falls into the territory of it being one film dealing with one decade as well, with Dawn being set in the 70s, Day being set in the 80s and the Night remake being set in the 90s. Each film had a lot to say on the decades they were made in, and what Night says about the 90s is that the 90s didn't really know what it wanted to be. I personally prefer Ben and Barbra in the remake to the original as well, and I also enjoyed the very mild tonal reworking that this film has over the original. It sacrifices its atmosphere and slow build in exchange for a more streamlined narrative that helps to round out and develop its characters, and it offers more horror and gore moments, which I can understand as a necessity of the development of nearly 25 years of cinema. This rounding out and development, however, relies heavily on the characters being strongly portrayed, and in some cases this works well. However, in other cases, it doesn't, with awful results. Ultimately, I suppose that this is a pick your poison scenario with these two films. The first is incredibly moody, but it's just way too padded and has some very underwritten characters and performances for my taste. The remake is tonally in line with the sequels and the franchise as a whole, but it's at the cost of the original tone and mood. It waters down the stronger characters of the original in order to help pull up the weaker written characters from the original, and it absolutely obliterates what was a brilliant ending to the original. I think if push came to shove, I'd probably recommend the remake over the original at this point, as I honestly preferred it. It has more elements going for it rather than against it, though both versions of the film have tremendous flaws in my opinion.